Can the government really restrict your travel during the time of a pandemic? We're going to talk about what the Constitution says about that today. And what if your wedding's been canceled during this time? Do you have any options? We're going to talk about those and many other topics today on #Lawyered. Hey guys, welcome to the virtual work from home #Lawyered episode 2. Andrea and I are happy to be here. Thank you for tuning in and listening, especially during this time. Andrea, how you been holding up during this pandemic?
Oh, just dandy, rainbows and sunshine over here while working from home,
Yeah, I know everybody's do what?
How about you?
Well, about the same. Everybody's obviously got some unique situations. I think one of the best things about the fact that we're doing a Zoom podcast is that it's actually right in with the times at this point, and everybody understands the difficulties. So we'll apologize for any skips or pauses or anything like that, but I think everybody's kind of gotten used to watching TV that way at this point.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for the new normal for sure.
Definitely. And just so everybody knows, when Andrea and I were planning this out, we actually talked about trying to steer away from anything related to the coronavirus. And Andrea had a great point. There's really too much going on right now to not talk about Corona and how the law impacts what's been going on with all this. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about travel restrictions. We're going to talk about wedding venue contracts and what that means. And we're also going to cover a couple of stories that deal with actual lawsuits dealing with Dallas County and the surrounding counties. So I think one of the most interesting topics we're going to cover today that, Andrea, you've kind of been passionate about is what is the government's power? What can they do to restrict travel during a time like this? And it's interesting because that affects everybody. Everybody loves travel, but it's a big question as to what we can and can't do and what the government can and can't do.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you said, I'm passionate about travel, whether it's, driving up the road to Fredericksburg or say flying out to, some cool new country. It's great. Love it. Unfortunately, it's a little restricted right now. And so, we have these things, right, called rights, fundamental rights. Everyone knows about your right to free speech, your right to, I was going to say bear arms, but that's a little controversial.
Yeah, we don't have time for that today.
Not today. Due process, all that great stuff. But there are things called, fundamental rights that aren't necessarily actually listed in the Constitution or in the Bill of Rights. And so the idea of your freedom to travel, it's going to be, in that Bill of Rights, in that Constitution, but not explicitly stated. So,
and I guess that would be a little different, like your fundamental right to give birth to a child, to travel,
absolutely,
to marry. Those are different than the privilege you have to, say, drive a car, which has more restrictions, and it's not just a fundamental right vested in the Constitution, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So the idea of freedom of travel in between the states and within your own state, it's considered a fundamental right. And the constitutional basis of that is a little murky here and there. But, in terms of traveling, intrastate travel amongst the different states, we have cases going all the way back to 1849, popping up again in 1920, where the courts are saying that, hey, look, the fundamental right to travel amongst the states is a right that you as an American citizen have and shouldn't be abridged. All right, well, it seems pretty clear.
And that was something that I think, if I recall, that played a little bit of a role in some of the civil rights cases that dealt with, blacks versus whites, and where they could travel, where they could stay, restaurants, buses, or bus stations, all those kinds of things.
Absolutely, it did, because the idea of the fundamental right to travel, while it has a lot of different sources, it comes a lot from the Privileges or Immunities Clause of the 14th Amendment, and which basically says, your privileges or immunities as an American citizen shouldn't be infringed by the states, or so on and so forth. So that's, the big source for why you're able to travel. And, then we've got all these cases back, 19th century, the passenger cases, and then the idea of the Commerce Clause, Due Process Clause, protecting your freedom of travel. That's all well and good and very technical. But at the end of the day, it's never really been disputed that you have a right to travel, say, from New York to Texas.
Right.
And then the concept of traveling, within your state, that's ironically a lot murkier. But
Yeah.
scholars go back and forth and they're like, yeah, you can travel. It's fine to travel within your state. And some of them are going to look at, again, the same thing as the privileges or immunity clause in the 14th Amendment. And then a lot of times, some states like Massachusetts will actually have cases in, for example, Commonwealth versus Weston W., back in 2009 that says, look, traveling within the state of Massachusetts is a fundamental right that any citizen of Massachusetts has. It's not going to be infringed upon.
Well, and
So
the interesting thing about that, when you look at it, because you think, okay, interstate travel, there's more going on there. Maybe there can be more restrictions. But actually, what we've seen, especially currently, is that intrastate, within your state travel, that's what's primarily being restricted with some of these executive orders and city ordinances and things that are going out. And I found that to be pretty interesting that, like you said, it's a little murkier. So the government actually has more power, it seems like, because there's not as much of a black and white line as there are with, like you said, the due process of traveling amongst the states.
100%. But, Austin, this idea of limiting your ability to travel within your state doesn't just come out of nowhere. This has happened before, back in, around the 19th century, when we actually had this thing called yellow fever down in New Orleans and Louisiana. And then we had this restriction movement within your state again in California with the Japanese internment camps in World War II, which is a little shocking.
Yeah, well, it is. And when you brought that up during some of our pre-production meetings, sure, I thought it was very interesting because the two situations, they're similar in terms of what the law applies, but when you think about it, obviously Japanese internment camps, we're not comparing the pandemic to Japanese internment. That's more of an intentional action versus a virus. But it is interesting because that actually went all the way up to the Supreme Court and was heard and decided.
It was. And I think the takeaway that's really interesting from Korematsu versus the United States in that regard, when it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, is that at the end of the day, the Supreme Court said that, look, we're in a war with Japan and the Japanese at this time are the enemy. And in order to protect the American people from these not really visible threats of, espionage or other spycraft, we're going to go ahead and say it's fine to make sure that people of Japanese ancestry in military areas, such as the one that Mr. Korematsu was living in California at the time, are restricted from traveling. They can't leave, or they have to go to a Japanese internment camp. And I'm like, excuse me, what now?
Well, and the interesting thing about that, because obviously as we know, and as we've tried to talk to people about on this show, the speed at which our judicial system moves is very slow. And so with Korematsu, obviously World War II was going on for a number of years. The case was heard in 1944 by the Supreme Court. There was still an ongoing issue at that point. Mm-hmm. Difference now, with specifically what we're talking about here, practically speaking, is a lot of these restrictions are going to be lifted. They're already starting to be lifted. So we're probably never going to see a court actually look at this. Mm-hmm. And so I think, what's interesting here is to talk practically is that it's a very lawyer answer, but there's not a real clean cut yes or no as to whether the government can restrict for something like the pandemic. And I think that's part of the reason. I kind of like to hear your opinion on this. I think that's part of the reason that these orders and ordinances have been put out, but you're not seeing people get arrested or fined or you're not seeing any real enforcement. It's been more of kind of an accountability thing. I kind of think that's because, and this is a long connection here, but it's partially because there's not a black and white, yes, the government can restrict, no, the government cannot.
Absolutely. And, I would agree with you on that. I think also too, back in the 1900s, you actually had a quarantine case in Louisiana. Again, the New Orleans yellow fever, where a ship with American passengers on it was prevented from docking and disembarking both American and foreign nationals because of the absolute quarantine on yellow fever that had hit New Orleans really hard that the previous years. But I think what you're discussing, how there's not really a clear answer, can the government restrict your travel, can it not? I think that's true, and that's probably why they're not really doing a lot of the enforcements, because they're trying to restrict people's damages that they could have if they bring a lawsuit forth. But I will also say that even if at the municipal level or at the state level, governments all of a sudden decided to start cracking down instead of lifting. I think at the end of the day, we saw with Korematsu, we saw with this yellow fever case, right, that the courts kind of have a funny way in times of national crises, and I think a global pandemic would qualify, of getting on board with the executive power and saying, maybe this isn't really jiving with our constitutional authority, but for the time being, we'll try to find a workaround in order to uphold the public good.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, my experience, it seems like our local authorities have done a great job educating and putting out the information. And I think it is good that we didn't get to a point where people were cracking down. I think there was a lot of self-policing that was going on.
Oh, 100%.
But, good news is for all of our Instagrammers out there, travel will, resume. And, our First Amendment will protect all those posts that are going to come from that naturally.
That it will, although I can't say about some of those, hater trolls on Instagram. I've seen a few, and my goodness, they've multiplied in quarantine.
They multiply, but they have less material to go after. Well, I say less material. They've got material that's not exactly as diverse because people are staying home. But that's been interesting to see. Speaking of things that pop up on Instagram, I know I've had many friends that have had to reschedule weddings. I've heard of many people that are having to reschedule events. That's something that's very practical, very applicable to everyday life. And when you sign up to be married, I mean, you would know more about this than me, obviously. But when you do set up a wedding, there's a contract you sign, and there's a lot of people that have had to go back and look at these contracts and see, all right, what are my options here? And so I thought that was definitely an interesting topic that you brought up, Andrea, is how does one deal with having to cancel their wedding? Do they have any leverage? Do they have any options? What are we looking at here?
Sure. Well, in short, whether you're Emma Stone or Princess Beatrice and having to cancel your wedding, or, some of my friends here in Dallas who've had to cancel their weddings, the answer is all going to boil down to it depends. And it's going to depend on the language of your contract, and most especially the language of your contract that deals with issues of force majeure.
Definitely. And force majeure is a word that, it's foreign, literally, to a lot of people, and basically it means some type of an act of God. So we're talking natural disaster, we're talking hurricane, earthquake, something of that nature. I think the interesting part that I've actually dealt with, not with wedding venues, but in discussing other things like events and other contracts that we've been looking at our office, is that it's not clearly defined as to whether a global pandemic, something to do with a disease or sickness, would actually affect this type would actually trigger this type of clause. Absolutely. And that's the interesting part. And then also, you brought up some interesting points earlier, that things like terrorism or riots, things like that, those aren't acts of God. They're man-controlled acts, but they still create the same type of problems. And so that creates a little bit of a conundrum that people are looking at in these situations.
Yeah, I think it definitely creates a conundrum because, at the end of the day, right, force majeure, it's French for superior force. Normally, like you said, it typically only has to do with the natural disasters. But, as you've seen contracts nowadays, I mean, they've expanded to cover riots, terrorism, civil war. And you're like, well, civil war is a little different than a hurricane. But
yeah,
a little bit, right?
A little bit.
But, some contracts will actually have, a pandemic. So if you say that your wedding is canceled and you're able to pull out your contract and look at your force majeure clause, if it specifically says pandemic, epidemic, you're good to go. But I think there's a lot of room to play and to argue and say, look, I've got this whole list of natural disasters, hurricanes, floods, act of God, and then we also have these man-made disasters. And, the Texas courts have a very particular view on contract interpretation. And so I think here in Texas, if you're able to list all these other prior disasters and say, I think a pandemic falls somewhere in between the level of a flood, a hurricane, an earthquake, and a riot, I think it's at that level, then, I think you have a good shot of actually being able to have your contract, of having to have your performance on the contract excused, meaning that you won't have to go ahead and shell out all that money for the wedding venue that you can't use, or those really pretty acrylic chairs you were going to use at your reception because you're obsessed with ghost chairs, so on and so forth.
Well, and there's also, obviously the language of the contract is what controls, but we also have common law and some concepts there that fall into play too. And one of those that we learn about in law school, I haven't actually seen it in my career yet because it's so rare, but is what's called the impossibility of performance. So
yes,
if you no longer can perform the terms of this contract, it's an argument. Doesn't mean it's knocked out, but it's an argument you can make that, look, I shouldn't be obligated to have to pay the venue for not being able to use it because the coronavirus made it impossible.
Mm-hmm.
It's always better, like you were saying, though, if you can more clearly delineate what are specific situations in the contract that will obviate my need to actually fulfill the contract. That's always going to be better. I think we've definitely seen, or at least I've seen from a lot of my friends, is that like a lot of citizens here going through all of this, our wedding venues have been very accommodating and have helped and allowed people to reschedule. And that's fantastic. Let's talk about worst case scenario. Let's say that the venue is not going to allow you to do that, and they don't want to go to the mat with you on the situation. What are your options, first off, and then second, in the future, because this whole scenario we've been in is going to change how things are done moving forward. In the future, what are a couple things people need to be looking for in these contracts when they're signing on to do a wedding venue or a big event that could potentially be impacted by this kind of thing?
Absolutely. So, in the future, one of the things you're going to want to do is really make sure that you take the time to actually read the force majeure clause. Previously, they've been considered pretty boilerplate language, but now post-coronavirus, I'm sure people can and should pay more attention. So, first, when you're reviewing that force majeure clause, you're going to want to make sure that, there's a clearly articulated standard for being unable to perform. So, whether that standard is reasonably impossible to perform or simply impractical to fulfill your contract obligations, you want to make sure that that standard is set out. And the second one is going to bounce back to what we've discussed earlier, right? We've got this whole list of horrific events in your force majeure clause, and I'm sure most of them already have tornadoes, floods, act of God, etc. covered, riots, terrorism, civil war. But now I think people are really going to be considering and wanting to put in there pandemics, epidemics, county-wide restrictions for sheltering in place because of viruses. Because at the end of the day, especially in Texas, you get what you contract for, and the courts love to interpret a pretty literal interpretation of your contract. So the best solution is to always put very specific instances of why you'd be unable to perform your contract, pandemic being one of them.
Yeah. And I know a big portion of this also is there's usually some type of notice requirement in the contract that says you've got to notify the venue that you want to exercise the force majeure or the impossibility clause. And that can be something that if you're not paying attention, you may miss the notice requirements and you've got a whole nother fight to deal with on your hands because you didn't fulfill your obligation under the let the venue know that we're not going to be able to perform in this contract.
Absolutely. And you want to make sure those notice requirements are reasonable, right? You don't want something that's 60 days prior to the wedding. If you want to cancel, you can get half a refund. But if it's 59 days, oh no, you're stuck. And then, well, sorry, friends, you're probably going to have to pay that full-on wedding contract, which really sucks. But you read your contract.
Well, and it's you definitely need to think about those types of things because 60 days in a vacuum doesn't sound that bad. But when you think about 60 days ago from now, things were completely different in February than they are now. And so that illustrates right there, emphasizes how you need to really think about what those notice requirements are for clauses such as this.
So I think lastly, too, is that a lot of the force majeure provisions in your contracts are going to have some sort of exit strategy. If the force majeure event, the tornado, the flood, the pandemic, if you're lucky enough to have that specifically listed, lasts longer than 30 or 60 days. So you're going to want to make sure that that clause specifically identifies, if the event lasts longer than the 30 or 60 days, what is going to happen? Are you excused from performance and do you get a full refund from the venue? Or do they get to keep the deposit? Say it's a photographer, the photographer gets to keep the deposit. but then you don't have to pay the full balance, so on and so forth. So just, it's good to keep that in mind, because you want to make sure that, okay, maybe you're excused from performance, but what does that excuse entail?
Yeah. What's the scope of that? How far does it go? I didn't think about, we were talking about venues. I didn't even think about the photographer and the caterer. Again, like I said, never planned a wedding, obviously, just been to a lot of them, just officiated a handful of them, but never actually, planned one. So that's a great point. There's multiple levels on this kind of stuff when you're dealing with big events like that. And so that's definitely something I think is going to change significantly, like you said, Andrea, moving forward. Now I want to turn to this other topic now that's directly impacts Dallas right now. And it's been something that has, the topic of releasing inmates has been something that's been interesting, to say the least, with inmates in county jail. And it's been met with, understandably so, quite a bit of hesitation, a little bit of fear and anxiety, some very opinionated passions about yes or no on that.
Really and opinionated, you don't say.
Right. And the interesting thing, it makes sense, right? They're talking about if people are being held for nonviolent crimes in loose stare in Dallas County, and they're in close quarters, they can't really social distance. We get that, right? So the idea is let's let them go, but there's got to be some kind of tethering of this. What do you think about the general concept itself?
Sure. So, I understand from a health concern that you have a lot of people packed together. It's a breeding ground for a virus to spread, but at the same time, if you're in there, usually there's a pretty good reason you're in there. Now, my opinion, if it
hey, don't get me started down that path. My opinions when it comes to why you're in there, when you're waiting on your trial and all that kind of stuff. But again, we don't have time. Go ahead.
Sure. So I do think that there are options, though, for people who are in there because of nonviolent crimes that are primarily like smaller drug offenses. I think there's room to compromise, and that if someone was a first-time carrier of a small amount of cocaine, heroin, nonviolent, no priors, at that point, I think there could be something worked out. Maybe some of these individuals can be transferred to a medical facility, or some of them could be transferred and under house arrest. You have much more criminal experience than I do, so I'm just spitballing here. So I'm going to let you be the expert on that. But I do think that there are options for those criminals who are not violent and don't have violent prior offenses.
Well, first off, let's say for those accused, we're not saying they're criminals yet because they're still in trial.
Yes. You know what? That's what happens when I've only had one cup of coffee. My language starts to get less than exact.
Well, I think as our listeners start to hear us more and more, it'll become very clear that I've practiced a lot of criminal defense because of the way my opinions and the way I talk about this. But we'll let them draw those conclusions themselves. But I think your point is exactly right. If you can put certain conditions on people's bond release and say, look, you got to stay at home. You've got to come in and you got to check in by the phone to your probation officer while you're awaiting your next court date. There's a lot of checks and balances that go into that. And I won't get off on this topic too much, but on our firm's website, we wrote a blog post a while back about some of the unconstitutional bail practices that are going on in Dallas County, which actually was involved in another lawsuit years ago for that. And some of the things that they talked about were there's a lot of ways to ensure that you've still got kind of a little bit of a handle on your defendants who are awaiting trial. And so I think that's definitely that would definitely be a good alternative. What's been interesting is that there's been a federal lawsuit filed on behalf of the Dallas County inmates because a lot of them have not been released, and because we are the second highest, you say this correctly, behind Harris County, we have the second highest concentration of coronavirus positive inmates in our county jail. So
very comforting thought, it makes me sleep so much better at night.
Well, right. And that's obviously what prompted the lawsuit, because you've got a rapidly growing contagious virus going on when people are all in, as by design, very close quarters. And a district judge threw the case out, dismissed the case. It sounds like it was on a procedural ground. And so she wasn't, it's a district ground. It doesn't say that she was commenting on the substance or the purpose of the lawsuit, saying it was unconstitutional or saying that it was frivolous or anything like that. But because of the way it was filed, the court did throw it out. The interesting thing about it is that because this is starting to, the virus is going away, we're starting to come out of it, this case may go stale. We may never see what actually happens if it gets refiled or anything like that. But it's definitely, it's one of the most unique situations I've ever heard of, where you're petitioning for accused citizens to be taken out of jail, which is contrary to what our county's bail practices are and what the Code of Criminal Procedure says, on the basis of this extreme situation we have going on. So just kind of a crazy situation all in all.
It is. And do you think that the concept that you have some people who are going to be out there and they're saying, look, confining these individuals when you have an infectious virus going around and people who have underlying health conditions like, say, asthma, are much more at risk, and yet you're refusing to let these people out, wouldn't that be cruel and unusual punishment, which is not permitted, per our Constitution? What are your thoughts on that? I'm sure there are a lot of people out there making those arguments.
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, I think legally it doesn't rise to the level of what the Eighth Amendment says about cruel and unusual punishment. I think, practically speaking, it sounds extremely inhumane to require people to continue to be confined in certain spaces with others who they know have contracted the disease. Now, I do know that the Lucerne, the jail system there, has done the best they can to isolate individuals who've been diagnosed, try and get them treatment. They've been doing the best they can with what they have. And so I don't think it's not due to negligence on their part or anything like that from what I've read. I think the flip side of the argument, opposite of the inhumane argument, is, well, if we're releasing these people, the obvious hypothetical anybody's going to be concerned about is what happens if they commit another crime while they're out, and because you released them, you allowed that and permitted that to happen. And candidly, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, it's a risk-reward balancing situation, and I think that's why they focused on nonviolent offenders, right? Nobody that, if you couldn't make bail and you were in there for some type of felony assault, you're not coming out doing this.
Yeah, I don't want
something
like that. Someone who attacked little kids coming back out on the street. Personally, that's my opinion.
Well, absolutely. In a society, we don't want that. But, maybe one of the more controversial ones would be, what if someone's being held on a DWI charge? Get out, they can still drive. You're probably going to have some restrictions on them, but they may not be able to afford something like a scram monitor or other things that are going to monitor the alcohol in their blood. And so you do still have a little bit of a danger of a further crime being committed. And obviously, unfortunately, the next level of that is if they drink and drive and injure or kill somebody. So it's one of those things, just like a lot of things that we deal with in our criminal defense system. You're weighing protection of society with individual rights. And when you throw the coronavirus in there, it just spirals everything out of control and kind of crazy. So it was interesting to see this progress. And from a legal standpoint, I wish we could have seen how it totally played out. From a human standpoint, I'm glad that it's probably going to become a moot point, and we're not going to have to worry about it any longer because this is finally seems to be passing.
Do you think it will become a moot point? And I'm going to continue that sentence. Do you think it will become a moot point, or do you think it's going to become an issue similar to Roe versus Wade, in that you've had this issue and it has a substantially real possibility of the situation reoccurring again, and so because it's very real that this situation can occur again, this massive pandemic, we should be dealing with this issue now, even though these inmates are no longer, say things are all better in a month, they're not concerned about coronavirus running amongst the inmates. Do you think these inmates will still have what we call standing to go ahead, bring this lawsuit and say, if this happens again, we need to establish what to do?
That's a great point. I mean, and just briefly for our listeners, you can't bring a lawsuit for something hypothetically that's going to happen unless it's happened and it's likely to happen again, which is how, like you were saying, Andrea, the abortion case in Roe versus Wade, she'd already been through everything, but this is a recurring situation, so she was still allowed to bring the suit. That's a great question. I would expect lawyers to argue the Roe versus Wade theory if they were going to try and keep pushing this. And so maybe we'll see that. I guess the difference here, as you've probably already kind of thought about, is that this is a once in a society, once in our country's history or world's history situation. Now, I mean, we could go back. I mean, the yellow fever situation you talked about in the early 1900s is probably one of the closer things that I've heard of from a legal standpoint that would rise to the level of this. I know a lot of other people want to make analogies with flu and SARS and all those things. I'm not qualified to talk about that, so I'm not going to try and draw.
I mean, maybe the Spanish flu in 1918, but that's kind of it.
Yeah, well, at least we have a court opinion to talk about that, so I feel like I can at least reference
exactly.
it. You know? So that's a good point. You know, I think that would be a little thin for them to say that, well, this could potentially happen again, so we want to have this lawsuit heard. But we've also seen where society's views and concerns can sway some of these legal concepts a little bit so that they actually will get pushed forward. We saw it with Roe versus Wade. We saw it with the gay marriage cases that went up and through that happened a little faster than we thought they would, but it was because it's a big issue for society, and it really needed to be decided because it was so polarizing. So that's certainly something we'll keep an eye out for, because I'd love to come back and report on it some more if it actually ends up coming to fruition.
Absolutely. I mean, God forbid there's a second wave, but if there is, this might be unfortunately a relevant topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is something that definitely, the next topic we want to cover, it has a direct impact on people and their day-to-day jobs, because I still can't believe this story when I read it. Dallas Business Journal reports that a former general counsel, in-house lawyer for a real estate company, real estate investment firm, was fired due to the fact that the lawyer refused to come into the Collin County office in violation of the shelter at home orders in Dallas. And so this lawyer has now sued the company, saying that she was wrongfully terminated. And so before we get into the legal side, just from a PR standpoint, what were they thinking when they fired her? I mean, come on.
No, they must be on some really desperate times if they're firing their general counsel for not violating a municipal order. That's crazy.
It is. And their reasoning behind it, of course, is, well, our office is in Collin County. You're in Dallas County. Collin County doesn't have shelter in place restrictions. But I mean, go ask 9 out of 10 people, not on the streets in Zoom meetings, because we can't have contact yet, but go ask 9 out of 10 people, what are they going to say? I mean, they're going to say, yeah, like, it's fine. Like, just let her stay at home. I mean, let's not forget the fact that she's a lawyer, and absent going to the courthouse, we can do most of this stuff in our house.
100%. I was just thinking that, because honestly, 90% of my work I can do at home, with the exception of hearings. And look, I mean, we're allowed to go to emergency hearings. I mean, you can speak to that. So it's really ridiculous to me that they're firing a lawyer as opposed to someone who literally, say, a dental hygienist. You can't take your work home as a dental hygienist. You are in the office sticking your hands in people's mouths. So that, a completely different situation.
Right, absolutely, and let's not forget the irony of the fact that they fired a lawyer who is now suing them. I mean, come on, that's like one of the first things that people say whenever they go cross as lawyers. Like, oh, geez, all right, this is going to be even worse, because they kind of know what they're doing.
Know what we're doing.
Right, and not that we're extremely litigious on our own regards, but like, we kind of understand the lay of the land sometimes. So it's very interesting to me, and it's interesting that it already got to a lawsuit phase. I mean, from what I can tell, it's actually been filed, and they're not talking settlement at the beginning. They went straight in to fire the shot, and I just don't understand. I mean, it seems to me that the upper management didn't do a lot of talking before they made this decision. Didn't really consider some of their options. I mean, I think that she's got if they don't settle, I think she's going to have a great argument to win this case and get whatever her damages she can prove up with her salary and all those other things. I think it's going to be a slam dunk. I guarantee you, if I was her lawyer, I would have definitely already demanded a jury trial, because
100%.
Yeah, I mean, jury's going to eat this up.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the jury's going to be sitting there. First of all, they're not going to want to be, in a public place, in a public setting, sitting close together during the coronavirus, which, I mean, for the most part, they're not right now. But I think, second of all, they're going to have the same opinion you and I have, which is, what the heck? She can do most of her work from home. Why?
Yeah.
Are you just trying to cut payroll because you're having financial difficulties? We'll find a more creative solution.
Right. Everybody else is having to do that.
Everyone else is doing this. Why can't you do the same thing?
Yeah. And I mean, I'm making a complete guess here. I have no basis to validate this, so this is just my pure opinion. I'm assuming there was some ego trip and ego power that was going on there, and whomever that supervisor was, I'm sure is probably not the best person in the world to work for anyways. And so
probably,
yeah, so maybe this general, maybe she's better off now having left and maybe, getting a little publicity here. But it just, again, I'm rarely am I'm not speechless, obviously, but rarely am I just so thrown off by something. But this move made absolute no sense. It flies in the face of all the messages that society, the media that are putting out right now about support each other. Let's stay safe. Let's do the right thing. And, I'd love to hear what Clay Jenkins has to say about that decision too, because it flies right in his face.
Yeah. No, it's flying directly in the face of all of his work and the orders that he's issued.
Right.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. And so it'll be interesting, I think, to watch how this plays out. Not just the lawsuit itself, but some of the PR and social media stuff that's probably going to go off on this will be extremely interesting, because people are obviously going to be opinionated. And I think even the people that there's people on different ends of the spectrum, right? That some believe that this is absolutely 137% as intense as everybody is saying it is. And then there's some on the opposite side that think that a lot of this is a hoax. And there's some extremists there that it has been a little interesting to watch. And then there's people that fall all in between. I think for the most part, though, everybody, no matter where you are on the spectrum, would agree that, hey, look, if someone doesn't feel safe, if they're abiding by orders, let's cut them some slack here, and let's be reasonable. I mean, even, and not to get off because this isn't the same thing, but even if you look at when someone who develops a disability due to a workplace accident or even a non-workplace accident, the federal law says that if they can't perform their job with reasonable accommodations, you're allowed to fire them without liability. But if you can provide reasonable accommodations and they can still perform their job, then yeah, you can't terminate them, because that actually can turn into a disability discrimination lawsuit. This isn't the same thing, but just thinking about applying that same analogy, very reasonable for her to work from home. Very
Absolutely.
Easy. We're all doing it.
It is. And then, bringing up the ADA, right? I think it'd be interesting if, and I have no idea if this is true, but, say that this general counsel had an underlying health issue like asthma. I would be interested to see how it would affect her case, because I mean, personally, I think that would only add serious fire to her argument, saying that they're discriminating against someone for, a disability that makes them vulnerable to a virus.
Geez, I mean, you may even, in that situation, you may even get into punitive damages with some, I mean, we've talked about intentional infliction of emotional distress before on this show. I don't know if we can get there again, but I mean, people are going to listen. They're going to listen, and I think if I was a lawyer, I'd at least make the argument, because it's so just confounding that this supervisor, CEO, whomever it was, made the decision. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out.
Yeah, I'll definitely be on the edge of my seat to see how this one turns out for sure.
Well, guys, thanks for tuning in today. Obviously, a little bit different. We're looking forward to getting back in the studio, getting back to normal, but we're also glad that we're able to join you guys today and give you some more information about the law and about what's going on in law and business here in DFW.
Thank you.